I'd always laughed at people who saw ghosts as being insane. I'd made jokes about our friends who claimed that they had psychic powers. And this was the thing which suddenly shocked me into completely reordering my own mental universe.
That's still the most real psychical experience I've ever had.
Is it possible to travel in time? To step through the curtain of our daily life and find ourselves in a totally different time and place? Different scenes, different people, different landscape. It is, of course, the very stuff of science fiction. But could it ever happen in real life? It's a question that has fueled scientific controversy for decades, and indeed it still does. But there are people who would claim to know the answer. It is possible. It has happened to them. One of them is no less a person than the famous psychiatrist and philosopher Carl Jung. In the 1930s, he was travelling through Italy and went to visit the tomb of a Roman empress in Ravenna. In his account of the episode, he describes how he became aware of a strange atmosphere in the place and an unexplained mild blue light everywhere. But what caught his attention was the remarkable beauty of a series of mosaics depicting maritime scenes. He stood in front of them and discussed them with his companion for 20 or 30 minutes. On leaving the mausoleum, they tried to buy postcards of them, but surprisingly, there were none. Later on, he asked a friend visiting Ravenna to obtain pictures for him. It was then that he learned the truth. The mosaics simply did not exist. These are the mosaics that were in the mausoleum at the time of Jung's visit, nothing like the ones he described. The mosaics that Jung and his companion looked at and discussed, infused with that strange pale blue light, had existed once, but then been destroyed by fire several hundred years earlier. Jung came to believe that he had indeed travelled in time and witnessed the building as it was in the time of the Empress herself, fully 1400 years earlier. Mary Rose Barrington is a paranormal investigator who has become deeply involved in these ripples in time, where people seem to walk out of one world into another time and place. She has studied the Jung case in detail and believes there are extraordinary similarities with another case that occurred in this country. It involves the Bartons. They were a couple who ran a famous and much talked about bookshop in the 50s, and who often spent their leisure time walking in the Surrey Hills. On one of these walks, they believe they travelled back in time to another landscape.
Before we left the flat in the morning, I had been extremely depressed and didn't want to go for the walk. And unknown to me, he'd felt the same, but we neither mentioned it. We thought it would just spoil the day.
By some strange compulsion, they still don't understand, they travelled on beyond the spot they had intended and eventually stopped in the village of Wootton Hatch. Once there, they decided to visit the tomb of John Evelyn, the famous 17th century diarist.
We were rather surprised to find the gate of the tomb open, which we'd never found before. And so we looked round that, spent a lot of time investigating the memorials and the inscriptions and all the other bits that make up a very beautiful tomb. And then we left the church, walked down to the gate, and as we came out of the gate, almost immediately, we turned onto a path that was totally overgrown with vegetation. And then we began to climb this path. It was a very narrow path. We had to go single file to go up it. And we climbed up, 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 up. And then we came out at a point, at a clearing with a straight path and a clearing behind it, and wooded trees behind that. And then on the path, along the path, was a seat, a backless seat. And Eric said, why don't we sit on this seat? We spent so much time in the church. Let's sit on this seat and have our lunch now. It was now about 10 to 12 o'clock. I could only say that the depression was by now very, very overwhelming. just couldn't eat the sandwiches. And the only comfort came from the sound of a woodman and a dog howling, what it sounded like down in the valley. And as I was crumbling the bread and throwing it to the birds, there was suddenly a total silence. Not one bird was singing. I could still hear the woodchopper and the dog, but that was all. Everything went absolutely still.
Then Elaine, my wife, turned to me and said, "Is it cold?" Cold. It was a very hot day. No, certainly not. And she said, "Feel my arm." And it was icy cold.
And I saw, standing in the clearing behind, 3 men. And I went to turn round to look at them, and I realized I'd seen them through the back of the head. I'd say they were wearing a sort of cape, a black. They were all 3 of them entirely in black. The centre one was most definitely a clergyman, because he had a clerical collar on. And he had a smaller rimmed hat. The outer 2 men had a larger black rimmed hat. And I would have said that they were, as I say, late 18th, early 19th century. Looking back on it at the time, of course, you don't think like that. You just see the figures and or whatever and accept them. You don't say to yourself, "Oh, I'm seeing 3 figures from the 18th or 19th century." You just don't. I have no idea why one would have a visitation of figures from any period at a time like that and in a place like that, because it was out of place, apart from out of time.
Very disturbed by this forbidding apparition, they hurried on for a while along the lonely path, and then lay down and fell asleep on the edge of a field. They have only a faint recollection of how they eventually made their way back to Dorking Station to get back to London. Eric was so disturbed by the experience that on the following Sunday, he decided to return to Wootton and retrace the path of their walk to unravel exactly what had happened. But it seemed that the landscape they'd walked through no longer existed.
Reaching the church, Evelyn's church, doors were opening and people were coming out.
So he stopped a man who was coming out of the church and said to him, "Are you familiar with this area?" He said, "Yes, indeed, I am." And Eric said, "Well, can you tell me where?" And he described the landscape that we had been in. And this man said, "No, there's nothing like that round here." And Eric said, "Well, all right then, forget the landscape. Where is there a backless seat on the edge of a path?"
When I asked about the benches, there'd been no benches as far... he knew there was no bench in the whole of this area at all. No bench.
So what had happened to the landscape they'd walked through? The path, and the park bench, and the valley. Mary Rose Barrington was convinced that the key to this experience lay in the connection with John Evelyn's tomb.
Well, John Evelyn is the gentleman lying in that tomb, and he is famous for having written a diary in the 17th century commenting on political and social situation. And among his diary entries is a reference to 3 gentlemen, one of whom was a priest, and they were all to be executed for treason against the king, and he was very upset about this. And he happens to mention it in a diary entry in the same time as he's talking about having been to the church in Wootton.
The diary entry was for the 15th of March, 1696. And Evelyn wrote of his concern, and I quote, "for 3 unhappy wretches, whereof one is a priest, executed this week for intending to assassinate the king."
So I wondered whether Irina might not have in fact been seeing some landscape initiated through the eyes of Evelyn. in much the same way as the famous psychiatrist C.G. Jung appears once to have got into the mind of a Roman empress when he saw some mosaics.
But nothing in the paranormal is simple and straightforward. And both Irina and Mary Rose Barrington have come up with a second theory. It still involves time travel, but to a different time and place. It seems that on the 19th of July, 1873, Bishop Wilberforce was riding through this very countryside, on his way to Wootton House, indeed, to make up a quarrel with the Evelyn of the time. He was slightly ahead of his two companions when, on this spot, he was thrown from his horse and died. And strangely enough, it has many resemblances to the shape of the landscape through which the Bartons remember walking. So what did Irina witness? Was it the men about to hang that worried Evelyn so much on that March day in 1696? Or was it the sudden dramatic death of the clergyman Wilberforce in 1873? But there is a vital clue, a railway track. The Bartons distinctly remember crossing a single-track railway. In 1954, at the time of their experience, this was a double-track railway as now. Of course, at the time of Evelyn's diary, there was no railway at all. But in 1873, the time of Wilberforce's death, it would have been a single-track railway. But as we've said, nothing in the paranormal is simple. By visiting Evelyn's tomb, could the Bartons have linked the two events in some extraordinary way?
What these two things have in common is the priest. Therefore, I think they switched from the priest in the Evelyn story to the priest Wilberforce, raking through the centuries so that there was a fusion of landscapes.
So, in their walk through the woods on that still midsummer's day, did the Bartons skate through time, experiencing both Evelyn's concern for the three men and Bishop Wilberforce's sudden death, before returning, in a way they still can't explain, back to the present time. Travel back in time nearly 900 years to 1103. That was when the monks of Cluny founded the priory here at Thetford in Norfolk. For hundreds of years, this priory was a place of refuge and pilgrimage. During the Middle Ages, people flocked here because of its reputation for healing and miracle cures. Just 9 years ago, 4 young students, who came here quite by chance, believed they witnessed the priory as it was, hundreds of years ago.
The whole thing was emotional. It was more threatening, the entire place, than the figure, as you said before. The apparition was not.
So we pulled into the car park and wandered through, and it was a very pleasant, mild August night. As we walked through, we joked, made silly comments, but we also were fairly serious, keeping an eye open for the history of the place and wondering why we'd never come across it. Something else struck us, which was there was no one here. We would have expected, it's in the middle of a built-up area, in the middle of a town, we'd have expected children, people walking their dogs, people sitting, drinking out of bottles. No one. Very lonely place. Eventually we wandered, splitting up on the way, and gathered again at about this point. And while we were standing here, we were looking at the facade of the building in front of us, and through the small window, or 3 small windows, just up here, one of us drew attention to someone watching us. And then a few moments later, the person we saw pass across and come down through a staircase. Now, I wish to stress this, I know it's hard to believe, there was a staircase leading up through that archway to a doorway which you can't see but which is in the ruin behind. And so we saw someone coming down the stairs, and somebody remarked, it's someone wearing a black sheet, it's a joker trying to scare us, they're trying to pretend they're a ghost. And one of us began to walk forwards on the left, and in fact slowly increased his speed as he got closer and closer, and the figure began to retreat back up the stairs, at which point I shouted, "Let's get him," and began to run like this, walking through. I came running in. As I ran in, I tried to run up the staircase. I had the impression that I actually went a couple of stairs up the staircase towards a door above us. The figure had by that time retreated back across. Darren came in on my left, and as he came in, he also ran up the stairs. I fell forward, pitched, struck my head probably about here on the flint wall. Darren also struck himself, though he ran through almost to the back wall. We both ended up on the ground, and I was bleeding. It took us a few seconds to get back up and to look at one another and to realise that there was no staircase, that not only was the figure not real, but neither was the actual staircase which we had physically attempted to run up. At that moment, everything just went cold for me. I got up, Darren was already out, running back towards the car. I staggered back out, joined up with Axel, and we ran. We just ran in sheer fear. And I was questioning my sanity and everybody else's around me at that point. I really didn't understand at all what was going on.
None of them had had any previous paranormal experiences, but being scientifically inclined, they all agreed to go off and write down exactly what they'd seen independently of one another. Much of what follows is taken from those accounts.
Right, this is my account of the vision. It appeared to be a man about 5.5 foot tall, judging from how high he appeared to be relative to the archway. And he was wearing a black monk's habit in the sort of Dominican style, with the cowl pulled up and his hands clasped within his sleeves in this kind of a position, which meant that none of his skin or anything was visible in the light at all. It just was black with possibly darker face. You know, that's what I saw.
We advanced towards the steps that we could see that the figure was standing on. I felt nervous, but I was so curious that I had to continue. We walked towards the steps, and as we approached the archway, I was still convinced the steps were there. The figure had gone, disappeared, presumably up the stairs. I tried to walk up the stairs, but they weren't there. I just fell over. That's when I got up and ran.
It's odd actually, because my drawing doesn't look much like a cowled monk. What I drew and I wrote at the time was, it looks like a person wearing a black sheet or a woman in 18th century dress. And the reason I had the impression of the 18th century dress was it seemed to be flowing towards the bottom. I do agree that the arms were folded across. And also I noticed there were some dark points, almost glittering like coal, black coal broken, in the central area here, which I recorded on my drawing, which you can see in my statement.
The doorway seemed to be much darker than it should be. And then there was a cloud, smoke or something, which sort of grew and became bright. I didn't actually see a figure. I just saw a column of smoke glowing and slowly becoming bigger. And basically that's when I panicked and fled.
From these accounts, it's clear that all four witnessed a strange and inexplicable event, and it triggered off in all four a profound interest in the science of the paranormal, in an effort to come to terms with their experience.
The environment has triggered something in us, and we all see it in our own minds. I mean, I don't think that invalidates it just because
there's an individual perception of it.
Just because I saw a column of smoke, you saw an individual, you saw someone in a habit. That's all maybe the emotions that have been taken at that time.
Well, I suppose that when you think about it, there are various explanations you could offer beyond the ones we've talked about. The idea it's a recording of the dead abbot or prior, wasn't it? It's a recording of him reenacting, or possibly because we had the feeling of the priory being more real as we left it, as if it was coming into existence around us or somehow very close.
Certainly.
Time slip? I don't know.
But the physical thing to me was the staircase. I mean, I can't think of any reasonable explanation for that. It's not a ghost, it's an inanimate object.
But if you have a ghost of a man on a horse, you have to have the horse. And if you have a ghost of a horse and carriage, you have to have the carriage. The carriage doesn't have to have a soul or a spirit, but it still appears. And therefore the ghost on the stairs wouldn't have made sense unless we'd seen the stairs. So that the stairs might have even been added by our own minds to explain how the figure was coming down.
Possibly,
we actually sort of did the window dressing for the experience we were having. Axel, what did you think about the place becoming more real as we left?
I wouldn't have said it would be caused just by the fear, because it was a lot more... Because it's not an imposing place.
Well, no,
it's not something I'd find imposing.
But it seemed it at the time.
Yeah, and I think that was possibly due to the kind of... The time slip theory does account for that a lot more effectively. Just the fact that we were being...
As if we were partially slipping back.
That's right, yeah.
We were closer then.
Yeah, as if we were much closer to the time period when it happened, when it was a functioning abbey. Or priory, rather.
There's the Wootton time slip. There are various famous cases. But in many of those, people experienced a dreamlike state. an altered state of consciousness, and often felt depressed. The two ladies who had the experience.
This event has had a powerful effect on the shape of Chris's life. He is now involved in research into the nature of consciousness. He's also spent some time digging into the history of Thetford, and he's come up with a murder story.
What actually happened was in the late 14th century, a prior who was actually, that is the prior's quarters, the building where we saw it, and there was actually historically a staircase going up at that location. And the prior was murdered by one of his monks, who was from France, who he had refused permission to return to his home territory, so to speak. And the monk repeatedly stabbed the prior in the stomach and chest. And after the death of the prior, within the prior's quarters, the monk was taken to Norwich Castle, where he was branded, his eyes were put out, and he was incarcerated for the rest of his life in a dungeon under Norwich Castle. This is a matter of historical record. We actually found this out after you'd left.
Oh, right. In the
when we
library.
actually went to the library and conducted research. But we didn't know that at the time, and that information was only available, as far as we've been able to find out, in a late 19th century book on the history of Thetford, which has a small reference to it. So it's not a popularly known fact. So there's no way we could have heard that information, forgotten about it, and then later on we could have reinterpreted it because we suddenly realised we were in the right location for the story.
Is it possible to travel in time? That was the question we started with. No one would claim that these events provide a complete answer to that question. But they do suggest that time is by no means as simple as the relentless onward ticking of the clock would have us believe. There are, it seems, ripples and discontinuities in time, parallel existences running alongside our own. It would seem possible for any one of us to turn a corner or pass through a door and suddenly find ourselves in a strange and alien world. One of the most extraordinary findings from our researches for these programs is that the so-called paranormal is far more normal than is commonly believed. Go to any town or village, almost walk down any street, and you will come across stories of extraordinary events that are difficult to explain away on any rational or scientific basis. In this program, we tell two strange stories that come from Devon, from villages on the southern edge of Dartmoor. The Allen family live in the village of Heathfield Down. They're just about as typical a family as you are likely to meet anywhere in England. Ricky, the father, is in his early 50s. He served in the armed forces. His business ran into trouble during the recession, and he now runs a minicab service. Jackie, his wife, is a highly qualified surgical nurse. She spends her days in the operating theatre at the local hospital. Suzanne, the daughter, is 21 years old, and Richard, the son, is 20. The first indication that things were not quite right was a strange sense of dread and foreboding in Richard's bedroom.
It was very strange feelings I had inside myself. The ghost actually felt like it was, I don't know, telling me to do things or trying to, but it was all very confusing, really.
There was not arguments, but it was fraught. Richard especially was always in strange moods. he would get in really bad moods for no reason and things like that. And you didn't feel happy wandering about the house, or I didn't feel happy wandering about the house at night.
At first, the family was scarcely able to admit to themselves that anything was radically wrong. But the strange events and disturbing feelings continued unabated, growing more unnerving all the time.
And then there used to be this smell of, it's like you have a candle, you blow it out, and it's that instant smell afterwards that you get. And it used to be up the top of the stairs, on the stairs, in this room. Not all the time, but when it come, it was strong.
My TV used to turn on and off and over channels quite a lot. It used to just, the remote control used to be on the floor. There was no reason, nobody was using the telly downstairs. We tried the remotes in the other rooms to see if it would switch channels in other rooms, but it didn't. So that was another thing. Also, when we first moved in, the toilet chain used to flash for no reason. We actually had all the bathroom taken out and put back in when it was refurbished, and obviously everything was new. It used to be an old chain flash that you pulled down. It's all new, but it still used to happen. The chain would still go, especially at night when you were settled down to sleep.
So desperate did the situation become that Brenda, a neighbour interested in spiritual affairs, was asked if she could perceive anything wrong in the house.
There was something definitely wrong in this room. In fact, it was such a powerful thing that I could hardly stand up. I tried backing out of the room, which was very difficult, to get down the stairs. So I had to sit on the stairs because the power was too much for me.
I had a phone call from Brenda to say that this house was very, very cold and there was a lot of bad vibration. The family itself, the atmosphere amongst the family had changed. I rang Helen, who was my friend, who we worked together, and arranged to come out.
John Parker's day job is bricklaying. In the evenings and at night, he operates a psychic rescue service for people in distress. He claims that his caseload runs into the thousands. Helen is described as a trans medium. As John explains it, entities or spirits they encounter would enter Helen's body so that John can talk to them and try to convince them to move on to the next world. Helen, however, didn't want to be filmed.
As they walked into the door, Helen walked straight upstairs where she felt she ought to go, and John came into the living room here. And Helen came down a few minutes later and she said, yes, there's definitely an entity up there that shouldn't be there.
And she said, basically, John, we've got to do this tonight and now.
We were all sitting round with our arms folded across our solar plexus. This was so that the entity didn't jump in to anybody else. We also were not supposed to speak for the same reason.
Helen sat down and went into a trance, and she just breathed very deeply. John then started to talk after a while to Helen. The voice come through. First of all, it was another lady who puts the spirit into Helen's body, and she said she was ready to begin.
And it didn't actually strike me it was actually real until the lady's voice totally changed, and it was like a really deep sort of masculine voice coming out of this lady, and the ghost was speaking through this lady, saying I wanted to kill him and things, and that freaked me out a bit.
According to John Parker's explanation afterwards, the spirit was a long-dead person called Philip. He lived on the land where the house now stands, and he was a practitioner of black magic. As part of one of his rituals, he had murdered his best friend, and now seemed unable to escape from the location.
And Philip come in. He was really angry at first. He started swearing at us and all sorts of things. It was as if he could use modern day language, but he couldn't understand it. John called him Babe a couple of times, and he kept saying, "I don't understand, Babe, I don't understand, Babe." Yet he could swear at us in modern day language.
The conversation between John and the entity, as I said, was aggressive, and the point of that was that the entity didn't want to leave. He was enjoying himself, he was getting up to mischief and generally creating havoc. And John's point to him was that he ought to go because of the havoc he's causing, and that he cannot advance himself or grow unless he actually moves on. It was his time to go. He shouldn't be here. It wasn't his place.
He tried to get up, or tried to get Helen to get up at the chair several times. John kept telling him to sit down again, but John said that he couldn't actually get out of the chair, but he was trying because he was just trying to escape.
There was one time when I felt quite afraid, and that was when the entity jumped out of the body of Helen, the medium, because nobody knew where the entity was actually headed for. So I think at that point everybody felt a bit scared.
John said, "You've been taunting Richard, you've been doing wicked things," and he said yes. And he said why, and it was all for power and control, and he wanted to kill people still, even though he was dead.
And there was a lot of to-ing and fro-ing, and John got a bit angry at times because of the swearing that the entity was doing. And basically it come down to it that it was actually a friend of his that he could actually see in the light that actually talked the entity into going with him from the light, plus his mum was there as well for him to go to.
We all sat there very quietly for a while and sort of just sat in shock, I think. It was, although things had happened before, it was a great shock to hear it and see it in front of your eyes. It's not the sort of thing that you believe until you see. We sat there for a long, long time, all of us, and sort of slowly, gradually, like you come round from a sleep, we began to talk.
I actually, in terms of speaking about it, I broke him and broke the mind so that he would accept that what he'd done. The minute you got to that stage, the attitude, a mental attitude of the spirit completely changed, and he became like an ordinary human being. All you have to do is to convince the person, the entity itself, that it is not of this world. Once you can do that, it is a simple matter then of bringing someone in and both of them going together. And it's as simple as that.
In John's explanation, the murdered friend returned and there was a reconciliation. And together they moved off into the light. That is always the phrase that is used. The point is that whether or not you choose to accept John's explanation, it is undeniable that something happened in the house that evening that transformed the atmosphere there.
Since it's all happened and John and the lady Helen has gone and the ghost has been sent forward and what have you, I haven't actually sensed any weird or different smells or any strange happenings. I've been a lot happier in myself, and my whole attitude's changed a lot, really. And there's no more flushing of the loo in the middle of the night or anything like that, really.
We don't get smells anymore. Richard's moods are better and things are a lot happier. I can walk about the house at night and up and down the stairs without worrying at all. I wouldn't worry as much as I did, that's for sure.
After John and Helen went, there was never, ever any more smells of candles burning, no more problems at all.
I went up into the bedroom where he was, and there was a very, very strong smell of sweetness up there, like very, very strong flowers. A smell that couldn't have been put there. It was very, very strong and very, very fragrant, beautiful.
few miles to the west of Heathfield Down, where the Allens live, right up on the edge of the moor, under the looming rocks of Hounds Tor, there is a lonely crossroads. This is the site of a single isolated grave, known to everybody locally as Jay's grave. Jay was, it seems, a young woman, Kitty Jay, and her grave is associated with a long-standing mystery. It always has a fresh spray of flowers on it. No one admits to putting them there. No one has ever seen anyone putting them there. But nevertheless, they are always there, day after day after day. Kirsty Peake has lived nearby for many years.
I ride past here every day. So I come up here with the horse to go and meet friends to go off riding. And when I come past, I always notice that there's flowers on the grave. And even when it's really bad weather, there's always flowers on the grave or greenery or something local. And I speak to people and they're not putting the flowers on.
During the summer, I come here very, very often, and there's always fresh flowers here.
Gina Williams is a local historian who has looked into the background of many of the stories of Dartmoor, including the story of Kitty Jay.
She was an orphan girl that took work at a nearby farm called Canna, and she became pregnant and hung herself because there was so much stigma attached to it. And she was buried at this crossways because they believed then the devil couldn't get at her soul.
Well, James Bryant, who had the land round here in the 1850s, 60s, he in fact had the grave opened to check and did in fact find the bones of a young woman. And it's he who had the grave made as it is now, putting headstones and footstones. And since then, the flowers have appeared, always.
Over the years, the mystery of the flowers has inspired many people to spend a vigil at the grave to see where the flowers come from, but with no very conclusive result.
Some time ago, some scouts camped here, and they watched all night, or so they said. They never saw anybody or heard anything, and when they got up in the morning, there were fresh flowers on the grave.
We asked John Parker to visit Jay's grave to see if he could shed any light on the mystery, both of her death and the perennial flowers.
To pick up a vibration, what is here and what can be seen. Here lies a young lady between 16 and 22 years old as I look at her, and she is laid out in this direction, pointing due east. From this, I pick up a vibration of very, very sad. But there's not one human remains here, but two. One of a baby, very, very, very small.
That, of course, doesn't really get us any further forward. We already knew that a young girl was involved, and the legend has it that she was pregnant. And that, of course, is the problem with mediums. It is extremely difficult to verify either the information they come up with or the contacts they claim to make. However, there is no doubt they do very often help to clarify or resolve difficult psychic situations.
When a psychic medium is perceiving something that has happened, the question is, what is occurring? Two sets of explanations. The first one is that these are particularly sensitive people, sensitive to non-verbal cues. So they're picking up atmosphere from everything which is around. There's nothing paranormal about it. That's the first explanation. The second one is that we do not yet understand fully the nature of time. You see, as far as the brain is concerned, time can alter enormously. For example, the whole of creation I can see in one split moment of time in certain mental states. So time is an artifact of the way the brain is constructed.
Nowadays, many people believe that, isn't mediumship just a bit of a charlatan's paradise and frauds and so on? And no doubt there is a percentage of mediums who are fake, but the fact that there are counterfeit coins in the circulation doesn't mean that all coins are counterfeit.
Counterfeit coin or real? We decided to set up a rather more difficult test. And so, without warning, we asked John Parker if he would visit the cottage nearest to Jay's grave to see if we could establish any verifiable connections with her story. The house is now owned by a retired couple.
We've lived here for about 10 years, having retired from the Royal Air Force, and we're well aware of the story of Jay's grave, and as you're aware, we're about the nearest really old house.
John spent some time walking round the house, absorbing the atmosphere. Meanwhile, we had arranged for a psychic artist, Mary Searle, to come to the house and sit in one of the rooms, set quite apart from John, to see if she could draw any of her own perceptions.
I couldn't find anything incorporating Jay's grave, but I have seen two people who have returned on a nostalgic visit. One, a lady, early 50s maybe, 5'4", 5'5". I also saw a man in the main bedroom, 40 to 50 years old, quite longish hair, with something around his neck with sort of two tassels, who I have the impression is like a clergyman. Other than that, there's nothing else, just that. But I think these two are here because when they were on the earth, they had some sort of association with the actual building itself.
John felt he'd made contact with two psychic personas. One of them he described as a clergyman, either the 18th century or possibly early 19th. Meanwhile, Mary, completely isolated, had drawn a clergyman's portrait. It was, by any standards, an extraordinary meeting of minds.
The vibration that I get off him is he's friendly, he's come for a visit. Yeah. As though he used to live here. Can you understand what you mean?
He used to live here, yes, but he wasn't like an owner of the place. I felt he lodged here, John.
I don't know.
Well,
I just all I can put is that he's actually stayed in this house.
Yes,
and
yes,
that's what I was picking up.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's uncanny that that both John and Mary can come up with the same thought in one hand and portrait in another of the same person, being the Reverend in this particular case. I don't know whether he's put a name to it. Has he put a name to this? Or just says parson or clerical? And that also Stephen Nosworthy is mentioned in our deeds.
A Reverend Nosworthy, Stephen Nosworthy, is mentioned in these abstracts of title. And although I feel that he didn't actually own the house, his family, the Nosworthy, owned it, and there's no doubt that as a vicar in the local parish, he no doubt either passed this way or may well have visited a house owned by his family during the early 1800s. Well, I was impressed by the similarity in what the two people had to say, because although I'm not specifically a skeptic, I would say I'm a bit of a realist. I would like things presented to me in hard fact, but I did find that it gave me a start when the parson or vicar type element was introduced into the conversation.
But John had mentioned a second person, a woman this time. Remarkably, Mary had also produced a second drawing of a woman with the name Eliza attached to it.
As far as Eliza goes, in the deeds there is an Elizabeth Nosworthy who, in fact, was going to marry Robert Nosworthy, and looking at her face, I would think that although there have been Elizabeths later on in 1910, this woman is obviously too old looking, I think, to have been a 19. She's got to be one of the older characters, and is possibly Elizabeth Nosworthy, who would look very weather-beaten even at the age of 50, because up here would have been a very hard life. It's bad enough at times now, but then it would have been very bad indeed.
Just who it is who puts the flowers on Kitty J's grave, we may never know. But we do know that one Reverend John Nosworthy, and later on a woman called Elizabeth, must have passed these very crossroads on many occasions. And who knows, they may still do so. Certainly it would seem some element of their presence remains detectable in the house beneath Hound's Tor.